Hello, welcome. I'm Larry Jacobs, and I want to welcome you to a webinar sponsored by the Certificate in Election Administration, which is housed at the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. I'm a faculty at the University of Minnesota in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Thanks for joining us. We've got a terrific program today. Just a quick word about the Certificate in Election Administration. This is an online program, 12 credits. It provides professional training in election administration, both for experienced longtime officials, as well as for folks who are new to the field or would like to get involved in becoming an election official. This is an entry point. The courses are all taught by leading experts around the country, and we have carefully put together the courses to provide cutting-edge training. There's certificate if you complete all 12 credits, and the course credits apply to both undergraduate or graduate degrees. So this is top 10, Big Ten university course that are taught online on election administration. We'll give you more information later about that. For this conversation today, we want to get you involved in the conversation. You'll see at the bottom of the page, there's a Q&A button. That's for you to give us questions, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. The center, which is part of the election administration program, has a number of terrific events coming up in June. Coming up next week on June 2nd, we have a really terrific program on training and retraining staff and poll workers. That's June 2nd at noon Central Time. Join us for that. If you're interested in the coronavirus pandemic and how it's being handled in Minnesota, we have the Commissioner of the Department of Health in Minnesota who will be joining us on June 11th. And if you're interested in national politics, the head of the U.S. House Republican Re-election Committee will be joining us June 23rd to talk about his strategy for gaining majority in the House. We have an invitation out to the Democratic counterpart, and we look forward to having her later in the summer. Very excited about today's program. This is maybe one of the top issues in the country. When you look at where we are, clearly the coronavirus has changed that context. We are looking at increasing interest, pressure, progress on vote by mail or vote at home. And to be clear, as you'll see in today's program, of course, vote at home has been underway for some time. We see red states and blue states doing this, and they've been doing it, again, for a number of years for a variety of reasons, some to save money, for simplifying the administration is another factor, and now the coronavirus has created another push or impetus for expanding vote by mail. And clearly, election officials face a dire challenge in conducting safe, accessible, and secure voting. And vote by mail is one of the ways that that's being pursued. Today's program is going to be looking at both the federal level and what's going on in the states. And of course, the US Constitution gives power over administration of elections to the states. So the states are absolutely the kind of focal point of how elections are being run around the country. We're going to begin in a moment looking at the federal level. We'll be having Senator Amy Klobuchar join us via a video to talk about her bill and some of the steps that she's been trying to encourage Congress to adapt. Senator Klobuchar will be followed by Matt Weil, who discusses Senator Klobuchar's history and work in this area. as well as the prospects for the bill she's proposed. Matt is director of the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Following Matt's presentation, we'll then move to the state level. We're very fortunate to have two of the top people in the country with us. Wendy Underhill is Director for Elections and Redistricting at the National Conference of State Legislatures. She will be presenting and discussing what is going on among the states. And then Tammy Patrick, who's a senior advisor on elections at the Democracy Fund, will join us. I should also mention that Tammy Patrick is on the steering committee for the Certificate in Election Administration, as well as being an instructor. So she's kind of my boss, so please be nice to her. We're very eager to get started, and we'll now begin with Senator Klobuchar's video.
Thank you, Larry, and everyone at the University of Minnesota Humphrey School's Certificate Program for Election Administration. This is truly a one-of-a-kind program, and the work you're doing is vital to improving our democracy. There should be more efforts like this, especially now, which is why I'm leading a bipartisan bill that would help people continue their education through similar programs. I know that many of you are joining this webinar from across the country, but I have to give some credit to my home state. As you probably know, Minnesota consistently has the highest voter turnout rate in the nation. And I want to acknowledge the great work our Secretary of State, Steve Simon, is doing to make our elections resilient and to make them open, transparent, and welcoming. The work election officials and administrators do is hard enough as it is, and now you all have to work to administer elections on the front lines in the middle of a pandemic. This is an unprecedented time, but the show must go on, and I'd like to thank all of you for making sure it does. Coronavirus can't stop our citizens from casting their ballots. I don't know if anyone is there from Wisconsin, but certainly that was the siren call for the United States of America. Wisconsin voters stood in front of the nation for hours in the rain in masks and in garbage bags and homemade protective equipment. In Milwaukee, where 2/3 of Wisconsin's African-American voters live, just 5 polling locations were open, down from the usual 180. Green Bay went from 31 to 2. That shouldn't have happened. We know that in many states, they have been successful in postponing primaries, but we know we're not going to be able to postpone the general election. And so I thought what I saw there in Wisconsin was people who said, you know what, I'm not going to choose between my health and my right to vote. And many people requested early ballots, but the idea here is we need to educate everyone on how you do early voting. Now we're hearing that people who voted and worked as poll workers in Wisconsin are testing positive for coronavirus, including a poll worker. We need a plan to make voting safe and easy. That means expanding voting by mail and also expanding early voting. So what do states do? Well, first, every state must allow every voter to cast a ballot by mail if they want to. That's why we're working to get money to the states for envelopes, postage, and the like. Additionally, we need to knock down barriers that make it hard to vote by mail, like witness signatures, notary requirements. Yes, 6 states require either a notary or 2 witnesses, and submitting copies of IDs in order to vote. But we know that mail-in voting won't work for everyone. So while we improve and greatly expand mail-in voting, we also have to work to ensure in-person voting is available and safe, which will include recruiting a generation of new poll workers. The relief package passed by Congress includes $400 million for election reform. It's a step in the right direction, and actually there were some conditions put on the money with a 20% match from the states that we'd like to change, given that state budgets can hardly make it day to day right now or paying for health care, much less this. So we're working on changing those conditions, which may or may not affect the money coming to your states. We also need to pass a bill that I have with Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, which is called the Natural Disaster and Emergency Ballot Act. Our bill would guarantee every voter has access to a mail-in ballot, as I just discussed, expand early in-person voting by saying it should be open 20 days. As you all know, because of your jobs, we've got, less crowded voting places if we open them up longer. It's just math. So if you do it for 20 days, you're going to have a lot of situations where people can come in and only a few other people will be voting. Also, getting rid of the requirements that I mentioned, like witness signatures and some of the more onerous ID requirements, providing paid postage and giving states the resources and funding they need. These solutions aren't new. They're time-tested and work. Americans began voting absentee during the Civil War. Today, we know our military votes that way. We have some states that almost entirely vote by mail, including more red states like Utah and states like Colorado or states like Oregon. Today, overall, 25% of voters cast their ballot by mail, and the majority of states offer adequate days of early voting. A recent poll shows that 4 out of 5 Americans support allowing anyone to cast a ballot by mail this November. And let's not forget, the President of the United States actually requested a mail-in ballot this year from Palm Beach for the Florida primary. If it's good enough for the President at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, it should be good enough for the people of Wisconsin and the people across America. Congress does have the ability to change the voting laws and get the funding, but it's up to all of you to implement the reforms and ensure Americans can make their voices heard. I can't imagine how many new questions you're going to be getting, and also how many new ways people are going to try to vote. We know it. We saw it in Wisconsin. They were only 6% mail-in ballot in the last federal elections, and look what happened this time, over 1 million people voting that way. So we know that there's going to be more and more people asking for mail-in ballots, and we also know that more and more people are going to try to vote early. Those are good things, but it's going to be harder for those on the front line like all of you to be able to accommodate it. So I just want to tell you, please keep doing your good work. Know that there are people that have your back, that are thinking about this. And as we are dealing with crisis after crisis, day in and day out, all of us still have to focus on that date in November. We in America are strong because we have a democracy that's strong, because people's voices can be heard, because we have free and fair elections. We can't let this pandemic take it away from us. Thank you for everything you're doing. Our democracy can't function without you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar, for joining us by video. I want to bring in Matt, who is Director of Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Matt, you follow what's going on in Congress in terms of election administration. Give us a little bit of background on Senator Klobuchar's work here and what you see the prospects for what she has proposed.
Sure. Well, thank you, Larry, for having me here today. Thank you to the entire Humphrey School team. I appreciate being a part of this. I don't want to say I'm the weakest link, but looking at Tammy and Wendy and Senator Klobuchar, I'm going to do my best to match up to all these other great panelists because I know how excellent they are. I'll say Senator Klobuchar has been a leader on this for many years. She is not new to this. I know there are a lot of new interests in elections right now, but she's been proposing bills, proposing legislation for a long time. You know, in just the 116th Congress, this Congress that started in 2019, she's the main sponsor on 13 election bills, and 12 of those happened before the pandemic. So again, she's not being responsive. She's been a leader. She's been working on many of these topics for a very long time. I will note, however, that of those 13 election bills, only one of them has a Republican co-sponsor on it, and that one co-sponsor is Senator Collins of Maine, and it's on the Investing in Elections, Investing in Our Democracy Act that the Senator mentioned on her bill. That's the same thing with her Natural Disaster and Emergency Ballot Act, which she proposed in mid-March in response to the pandemic. You know, I do think that the Senator tends to be right on a lot of the policy, but these have been polarized and partisan issues for a very long time. And there are some real ideological questions about what the role of the federal government should be. That's why you'll notice that in our entire history, over 2 centuries, we don't have that many landmark federal laws when it comes to elections. You have the Voting Rights Act, you have the National Voter Registration Act. You have UOCAVA, which is for military voters, and you have the Help America Vote Act. The Help America Vote Act, which is only 20 years old, not even 20 years old, was the first time the federal government provided significant federal funding for elections, $3 billion. So this hasn't been something that the federal government has done for a long time. We're still in the relative infancy of federal policy on elections. You know, in FY18 and FY20, so the fiscal year appropriations bills, we saw some funding for election security grants. In total, it was about $800 million. Again, this was the first time we saw significant funding from the federal government since 2002 to 2004. That first tranche of money in 2018 had a 5% match. That second tranche had a 20% match. And there are some reasons why you want states to have some skin in the game, that make sure we have some shared responsibility in funding elections. I think that's important. Now, the senator mentioned the $400 million in the CARES Act. Whether it was an oversight or intentional, that money also had a 20% match. And you know, while I've been supportive of having matches for federal funding for elections in the past, during a pandemic is probably not the right time to be forcing state legislatures, secretaries of state to come up with matching funds when there are a billion other things to do. I mean, some states don't have sessions all the time. I mean, Wendy can certainly talk about that. As of this morning, all states have requested their funds, so they were able to work through those issues, largely because the EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, was very flexible on how they were going to consider previously spent funds for the match. You know, in future funding, hopefully there's more money coming. I know the House has passed $3.6 billion in funding with no match. If the Senate does something and has a match, there isn't any low-hanging fruit anymore for matching. So any future matches are going to be extraordinarily hard for states to meet. And I will note that two of the states that took the longest to meet the match were Texas and Florida. So two pretty big states had huge problems. So just a quick look at the senator's bill. Again, I agree with her on a lot of the policy. I think that it would be a great thing to have these policies probably implemented at the state level, though. So it includes publishing emergency plans, 20 days of early voting, no excuse absentee voting for all, pre-processing of absentee ballots for 14 days minimum, a federal emergency write-in absentee ballot, similar to what members of the military have if they don't get their ballots in time, prepaid postage, signature curing. I will say that a lot of these don't have bipartisan support, especially at the federal level, and all of them would be incredibly difficult to implement in states that do not have them right now, especially before 2020. And we are not that far from the election. I know it feels far, and it feels like time is going really slowly right now in the middle of a pandemic. It is not that far away, and I have a lot of concerns. So, you know, I'll basically stop there. If I had to put on the table very quickly before we get to the Q&A later, I think there's still time and there's still a role for Congress to play right now. It's more money. It's as quickly as possible because there are very long purchasing timelines for states. I would say no match. And I would say, you know, as few restrictions as possible. As good as all the policy provisions are of Senator Klobuchar's bill, I do think right now that money has to be fully flexible so states can use it as they need to. And the other thing that I would put on the table is we want to make sure the funding is getting to the local level. You know, in the past, the election security grants were focused on cybersecurity. A lot of those expenses were at the state level. I do think that there's a lot more reasons to get money as local as possible right now because they're on the front lines, they're interacting with voters, they need the funds right now.
Matt, let me just quickly put you in the hot seat. Do you think Senator Klobuchar's bill will pass?
I don't. It has 36 co-sponsors and none of them are Republicans, and the Democrats are in the minority in the Senate. So those aren't good odds. And again, I do think, again, this should be a good conversation to have, probably not in the middle of a pandemic. States should definitely be having these because states could implement a lot of these things, or at least could put them on the table for state policy.
But just to be clear, the money part, could that be rolled into the fourth round of kind of rescue legislation that's being talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I would say at the beginning of the week, so what, 2 days ago, I wasn't that confident that we'd see more funding. I know the House passed $3.6 billion, although they had a lot of restrictions on that in their bill. But as recently as yesterday, Senator Blunt, who is the chairman of the Senate Rules Committee, has a lot of sway on this issue, also has a lot of knowledge about the issue, having been a Secretary of State and a local election official, has indicated that he does believe a fourth coronavirus relief bill will include election funding. He did mention having a match, so I'm not 100% on board with what he said, but that was positive, and the most positive public news I've heard for a while.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. We'll be back to you in a little bit. I want to now turn to Wendy Underhill, who's Director of Elections and Redistricting for the National Conference of State Legislatures. Wendy, let me just ask you to kind of tee up your presentation. What are states doing for elections in light of the coronavirus?
I am most happy to answer that question, Larry, but I want to start with thanking you for inviting me to be here today. And I want to say thank you to Lee, who's kind of behind the scenes. She's doing a great job of keeping us on track. So that's
definitely.
And I can't wait to have dinner tonight and tell my family that I was on a webinar with Senator Klobuchar. So that's going to be a thrill for me, even though she was on video. So I do have some things to offer. And Kate, if we could move to the first slide that I provided for you. And Senator Klobuchar certainly mentioned this. States have been delaying their primary elections because of the COVID-19 crisis. And here you can see which states have delayed primaries, and you'll see 2 states that are light blue that have delayed municipal elections. These states were states that were going to have elections in the very end of March and through April and May. And you'll notice an eastward trend here. And it doesn't mean that the states in the western part of the United States aren't interested. It's just that these states were ones that had regularly scheduled primaries in those couple of months and also did not yet have robust absentee mail operations. So kind of interesting to see that. This is kind of old news. I think the states that are going to move election dates have already done so. Maybe there'll be 1 or 2 more that moved a little bit, but as Senator Klobuchar said, we're not moving the general election. And Kate, we can move to the next slide too then. So then the other thing I've seen states do, and they started to do this right as soon as the middle of March came around, is figuring out how to allow, not just allow, but encourage voters to ask for an absentee ballot or to receive a mail ballot. And there's a couple of ways to do this. And I first want to talk about the states that are in blue. Those 4 states have either just now created an online portal for voters to request absentee ballots or have said that they are intending to do that as quickly as they can pull that together. And from my perspective, this is a little bit parallel to when states moved to online voter registration. So go in the history machine way, way back to 2011. It was really exciting if a state had it. Arizona had online voter registration, and at that point, I think just Washington State, 2 states, oh my goodness, such avant-garde states. Well, now it's 39 states have it, and so that was a slow trend, and the same kinds of questions that got asked back then are still the questions that people are asking now about portals for voters to get absentee ballots. How much will it cost to do it? We were asked that by another state just yesterday. Is it connected into your online voter registration? How do people access it? How do you make sure that only the people who should access it are doing so? And the answer to that might be that you do tie it into your online voter registration or that you tie it to your voter registration. So I think this is the coming thing. And there are 12 other states that I'm not showing here that already have this. These 4 states are just ones that have done it since COVID-19 really ramped up. And then the states that are in that sienna or burnt orange, those are states that are encouraging voters to vote absentee by sending them an application to do so. So in most states, to get an absentee ballot, you need to request it. And there's a million little sub-variations on that. But these states have decided that they will send out a application to the voters who would then fill it out and return it. So it's an encouragement for voters to do that. And there's some contention on this, and there's some cost associated with doing this. Getting any mailing out requires a design phase. It requires printing it. It requires mailing it. And if you're doing any mailing like this, you want to get the results back if it wasn't deliverable, so you can help use this as an opportunity to clean your voter rolls. And Kate, now I'll go without a slide, please. So then the other thing that states are doing is sending ballots themselves out. And there are 5 states that routinely in 2020 will be sending out ballots to all voters. California sort of becomes a 6th state because they've announced that they plan to do that for the general election. I can't quite put it in the same camp with the other 5 because it's not a permanent choice for California. It just references the election in 2020, and we'll see what California does after that. But maybe more importantly, Nevada and New Jersey are planning on doing this for their primary elections. So those are pretty big shifts. A lot of states like Montana and Arizona already have permanent absentee lists that allow many people to routinely receive their ballot by mail. And North Dakota and Montana have encouraged their counties to make this choice for the primaries. So the executive branch has said to the counties, you may choose to run your election by all mail. So little by little, that's a lot more states going all mail. Now, this is somewhat contentious, and there's a variety of reasons why it's more contentious than the application itself. And I think that has to do with the fact that it means that ballots themselves, which are very significant government documents, are out there in the community, which brings me to the point about fraud. There are people who don't want to see ballots being mailed out without an application to request it in the first place. And it's based on the perception of fraud. And probably everybody who's on this line knows that there's very, very, very little personal vote fraud. That's vanishingly rare is the phrase that people tend to use. But the perception is absolutely there, and it comes from a place in history. Certainly over the course of decades, there has been fraud in elections, and it's often been by political operatives, and it's often been by using absentee ballots in states where there's some either lax rules or some ways to kind of walk around the procedures that I'll describe in a minute. So what I hear sitting at the National Conference of State Legislatures is from legislators saying, not a chance in the world am I going to go down that path because it will introduce fraud every which way. So it is a real concern. The perception is real, whether the fraud itself is. I will say that more common than election operatives doing that kind of fraud is when a couple has one person die and the other one cast the ballot for the deceased spouse. And they do it almost to honor that spouse. It is illegal, they're misguided, but they do it sort of from an internal place of knowing how that would have been voted. And the other that I'm more aware of is when a ballot, perhaps a person who's beginning to have memory loss votes an absentee ballot and then shows up at the polling place not remembering that they've already done it. So these are onesies and twosies. And as you talk about this, it's good to know that there's little kernels of reality that then get blown up into the conversation about fraud. So what can we do about this when people ask us about fraud? I think it's to give the list of ways, and Matt addressed a couple of these briefly, and I think Tammy will touch on these in more depth, ways that we can ensure that mailed ballots, absentee ballots, or mostly mail ballots can be protected. And for my money, the first and most important is to have clean voter registration rolls. So any effort that goes into making sure that you know who should be getting a ballot in your state and not sending to anybody besides that is step number one. And then is there ballot tracking available so that a voter can see if their ballot did get back? And then is there a signature match? We can talk about that a little bit more if you'd like to, but do we really know that the person who should be voting that ballot did? And you could think of a signature match as almost a biometrics because it's hard to fake somebody else's signature. And then are the counting of the ballots open to the public? So there's a opportunity for observation that helps. Can the voter cure their ballot if there is a problem with that signature? Is there an opportunity to fix it? And then are there provisional ballots available? So these are all ways to ensure that the absentee ballot system is going to be safe and sound. And I do want to say just one more thing, and that's that no matter what you're doing with absentee ballots and moving towards more mail, there will be some amount of in-person voting required. And that can be made safer too in this time of COVID by going to curbside voting and all the things we've been hearing about, washing their hands and the PPE and social distancing. We will have some people voting in person. Let's make sure that's safe as well. And Larry, with that, I think I'll just stop.
Great. I want to jump to Tammy, but before we do that, I want to just pick up on your last point. I think there's concern about a lot of voting places are in seniors' homes, meaning, nursing homes or recreational centers that seniors use. A lot of others are in schools with our children. Do you have thoughts about the location of that in-person voting, which will absolutely continue as we head to November?
Sure. I think one of the key issues that local election officials have to tackle is where to hold their elections and who will hold them. In terms of where, you're absolutely right. It has been nice in previous years, but this year, I'm fairly sure that long-term care facilities or any senior living facilities will not be as likely to open up their doors. I've heard others suggest that if schools are closed, and can we all hope that the schools are open by November 3rd? If they are closed, then those would be buildings that could be used, and certainly government buildings can be used in various ways. And you might even, I hate to say this too, but with the economic downturn, there may be some storefront spaces that could be had at low rent. So local election officials tend to be very tight with their pennies, and they tend to be very creative. And I feel confident that they'll find locations, and finding the poll workers might be the harder challenge of those two.
Thank you. Delighted to have Tammy Patrick with us. Tammy Patrick is well known in the election field. She's senior advisor to the elections team at Democracy Fund. And as I said, she's one of my bosses, so please be nice to her. Tammy Patrick.
Thank you, Larry. And I will tell you, I have never once thought of it that way. I thought you were my boss, so that's good information for me to have. There we go. So thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation today. You know, I think that there's a lot to talk about. So I am PowerPoint dependent and I love visuals, so I wanted to really share that with people. The first thing I wanted to talk about was something that Wendy had mentioned, and that is the voter registration rolls are really the foundation of everything as we look towards November, as well as the remaining primaries this spring. But it's good to know that there are a majority of states have taken some key steps towards modernizing their voter registration. And this is a graphic we put together at Democracy Fund to really highlight three main elements: automatic or automated voter registration, online voter registration, and then the states that have joined ERIC, which is the cross-state data matching of voter rolls, as well as reaching out to eligible but unregistered voters. So it's good to know that over the course of the last few years, we have seen a lot of modernization of our voter registration rolls, because not only are we in a situation in this global pandemic where election officials are scrambling to conduct the election, we find ourselves in a moment where we are not seeing candidates, you know, supervisors of elections in Florida, the League of Women Voters in Iowa, at the farmers market, registering and making sure people's registrations are updated and current. So it's good to know that some of these good policy procedures have been in place. When we talk about voting at home and absentee voting, I always refer to it as kind of like an evolution, and it starts off with the absentee voting, where you have to have an excuse in order to receive your ballot by mail. And then what usually happens is that that excuse is removed and anyone can request a ballot that way. It tends to, as we've seen across the western half of the country, more and more people tend to use it. And then it gets to be a situation where local election officials and local offices can't possibly process the applications in time to get the ballots out. We saw that happen in Wisconsin. And what usually happens in the states that are all vote by mail, so Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Utah, is that they got there over a period of time. And what we're seeing in this moment is that states are leapfrogging some of these evolutionary steps. So in Wisconsin, traditionally, didn't have a lot of people request it, but now they literally had more than 1 million voters requesting it, and every application had to be processed. They also have it set up so that they'll have to send in another application in most states for the November election as well. So that's where states have moved to a permanent list. And Wendy mentioned this, California, Arizona, where 70, 80% of the voters are on a permanent list. And that's when the states kind of hit a tipping point and moved to full on all vote by mail or vote at home solutions. I think it's important to note that for tens of millions of Americans, the voters have their ballots handed to them by their postal carrier, not a poll worker. And it's been that way for quite a long time. And in this moment, we can't make any assumptions about what our voters are going to want or how they're going to behave in this moment, because we know from a recent Pew study, and there's been a number of research papers that have come out recently, that for the majority of our voters, they don't feel comfortable going to a polling place in order to vote. And so that's where we need to listen to the people that we serve, and the people as public servants, give them what they need and what they want, particularly in this moment. I talk often with the Postal Service and the mailing industry, and one of the things that I've tried to really highlight is that this is a partnership, and communication is incredibly important here, and that together we deliver democracy to the American people. It's not just another envelope, that's someone's vote. I was very fortunate when I worked with Matt at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We put together something called the New Realities of Voting by Mail back in 2016. And it really lays a good sound foundation for what everyone needs to be thinking about in this moment. There's a checklist for voters who want to vote by mail or are going to vote by mail, a checklist for election administrators, for state legislators, and a checklist for the Postal Service. Even though this was written in 2016, it's all completely accurate still, with the exception that that checklist for the Postal Service, we've been able to check off a few of the things on my wish list. But this is really a good way of summarizing what do we need to be doing in this moment? And my number one takeaway is don't scale up your existing policies and procedures, scale up best practices. So what are some of those things? The application process. Does your state require it for each election? Is it an annual application? Is there a permanent list you can get on? The number one challenge we're seeing are ballot envelope requirements and design. It sounds like such a sticking point, like why would that make a difference? But with all the automation that goes through our modern United States Postal Service, the way in which the ballot envelope is designed can result in the ballot being returned to the voter if it's not done properly. And that's where having things like the ballot tracking that was mentioned are really critical as well. One of the other elements, and this is particularly played out this spring in the primaries, are the statutory dates and deadlines. So we saw just recently in Ohio, on the Saturday before Tuesday's election, you could request a ballot to be mailed to you up until noon on Saturday for Tuesday's election. That's incredibly problematic because the first class standard delivery is 2 to 5 business days. So when we have statutory dates and deadlines that set voters up to fail, that's what we really need to be looking at. Also, making sure that there are ballot return options so that a voter doesn't have to rely on going and getting a postage stamp, making sure it's prepaid postage or that they can drop it off at a ballot drop box. And also making sure that postmarks and other data from the Postal Service would be validated and verified to make sure the voter mailed it on time. All of those things are both customer service, but it's also really sound security measures. What I would have been talking a lot about is we hear about flattening the curve, and I love this picture from Travis Weipart in Johnson County, Iowa. Up until this election, he had never had more than 714, it might be 16, I think it's 14, voters request a ballot by mail. He's now over 25,000. For this coming election. So in his office, this is how those applications are satisfied. Voters can really flatten the curve by requesting their ballots as early as they possibly can and then returning them as well as quickly as they can back to the elections office. The Postal Service recommends that voters mail back their ballot 1 week before that due date. So 1 week before Election Day. And that's again where those statutes can come into play. If you're still mailing out ballots to voters when they're supposed to be mailing them back to you, that's where we get into a conflict, and we need to make sure that voters then have other options in getting that ballot back in time so that it doesn't get rejected. Other things that states have been doing, this is an example from Kansas, where they said, you know what, not everything gets postmarked, and sometimes the postmarks are illegible or they're smeared or what have you. So they're expanding the definition of what is a postmark. It's really there to make sure the voter mailed it before the closing of the polls. So that's where they're including things like intelligent mail barcodes and processing marks and other things to make sure that the voters are, in fact, whoops, I went too far, able to participate effectively. Oftentimes we talk about elections being fast, cheap, or accurate, and you get to pick two. Election officials never want to not pick accurate, so it's always accurate. It's just a question then of whether or not they have the funding to do it fast, or if it's going to be slow and it's going to have to be cheap. And so that's something that's also important to know. I just have a couple more slides here to really think about is when we talk about in the elections offices, following the CDC guidelines, getting the funding for PPE is really critical because as was mentioned already, there are a lot of jurisdictions around the country that I've heard from that are being told they need to submit a 20% reduction in their ballot, in their budget for this year. The Secretary of State's office in California announced that their staff was taking a 10% salary cut and they were going to have to furlough some people. So this is not the time for us to not fund our elections. What will November look like? We really don't know quite yet, but we need to be prepared for everything. We're hearing from some elections offices. I was on a webinar with Wendy and a senator from Nebraska, and he said every one of his polling places, the facilities denied the election officials to use them as a polling place. Sacramento County said 75% of their polling places said you can't come back in November. So really, we need to be thinking about how can we solve both the facility and the poll worker problem, not just at the polls, but also in election officials' offices. This is taken just last week in Montgomery County, Maryland. And by the way, I troll everyone's Twitter account and steal their good pictures. But these are the same people that work in our offices, removing the ballots from the envelopes, doing this kind of administrative functions. And many of them are that same vulnerable population. So we really need to be thinking about our resources. Budgets are even tighter now, and every efficiency will count. So you juxtapose that picture of the people with the masks on, opening up ballots and sorting things with a high-speed scanning machine that you see here in Kansas City. In King County. So my number one request, and the thing that I always mention to people, is we need to be listening to our state and local election officials on what they feel they need in order to best service their voters. And that's really going to be one of the most critical things that we can do in this moment. It's absolutely the case that the American people and people around the world are feeling isolated, and it's really a challenging time we're all living through, but we just need to make sure that in this moment we don't forget that the vote is still our voice. It's just that this year it's quite possible that the ballot box will be the mailbox. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Larry.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of material. I've got writer's cramp. I don't know about the rest of you out there, but I suspect that some of you do. And by the way, this is recorded. We'll give you information on that if your hand's seized up. There's just so much information here, and I'm reminded of Washington State, which took 5 years to implement its all voter by mail process. And here we've got a number of states that are trying to move forward quickly with some fairly significant changes that under normal circumstances would take months and maybe years. So Wendy, I want to start with you. Put yourself in the position of an election official who's just been inhaling this fire hose of information and suggestions. What are the priorities? What are the most important things, and how should election officials be thinking about what they need to be doing first, second, and third?
Well, I do work for the National Conference of State Legislatures. So I think number one is have your statutes handy. You really do need to know what is the law of the land. And because even if the law has been interpreted in a certain way in previous years, is the thing you're thinking about legal in your state this year? And can the interpretation be a little bit different? And then my next thought would be that if you can figure out what you want to do, the sooner you figure it out, the better, because you'll have supply chain issues to contend with. You'll have notifying your county board or whomever you might report to, who will need to be on board with this. And you have the public who needs to understand what's going to be new and different about, and I'm thinking about November. So decide now, partly because you it's hard to change horses in the middle of the stream. So if you're going to make any changes, do it now. And then I guess if I got a third one, I would say it would be in touch with your voters. Maybe this comes a little bit later, but Tammy made some suggestions for voters. Get your ballot early, send it in early, let them know that they can help out by being on top of it, and also let the press know that the results might be late. So I hope that's a little bit helpful anyway.
Very helpful. Matt, I know you've got a broad portfolio at the Bipartisan Policy Center. What do you think of as the top priorities facing election officials?
I think that what Wendy just said makes a lot of sense. You know, I've been talking to a lot of local election officials, state election officials. You know, do you need PPE, and how can we help you source that? And polling places and in-person voting options, I think, are going to be a surprisingly difficult thing to find in the fall. I mean, Wendy had some good ideas, some outside-the-box thinking, and here's where we're going to run into some issues at the state level about policies or laws that are going to be problematic. I mean, you look at Michigan, you know, they can't consolidate the polling places easily. They have to be in government buildings. They can't be just at you know, for-profit you know, site. So there are going to be limitations. Yeah, I hear a lot of people out there who are against ramping up vote by mail, and my answer to that, or at least my response to that, is, okay, well then what is your plan? Because, you know, if we can't do more vote by mail, and if we're going to still have some sort of robust in-person option, that in-person option is not going to look like what it normally looks like. And no matter how good election officials are, and I am always in awe of what they can do on election day, the law is the law. They can't just create things out of whole cloth. So they're going to need some help there from policymakers. And I do have fear that as this has become more polarized, that's going to be some problem, especially in some states that are going to be really important, or at least that everyone's going to be watching on election night. I mean, I have a lot of fears about Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, where, you know, we are all going to be watching, because that's going to be the determining factor. And it's been very polarized, and they have some big restrictions ahead.
That's an excellent point. And Tammy, I want to ask you, what I hear election officials kind of mumbling about, which is expectations are so high for their work. You've got the networks that have got a microscope. They've set up their, you know, election evening for a broadcast on getting instantaneous results, results that are, you know, 100% accurate and inclusive. Are you worried that our expectations are too high, that there may be, you know, problems that we run into, whether it's through the postal office delivering ballots, whether it's the election offices counting the ballots, and going through the normal process in doing that?
So I think that there are a couple of pieces there. One is that I actually had a note that one of the things we need to do is set the right expectations all around the board. So it's really important, one, for election officials to be talking to their local postal service, to be talking to their election mail specialist, and you can find all of that on the Postal Service's website if you don't know who your state's election mail specialist is, and setting the expectation of what the volumes will be. The number of ballots coming in the mail is not a problem for the post office. They are expecting anywhere from 5 to 8 billion mail pieces of political mail this year. So think about how much political mail your house gets, and then think you would have one ballot to all those other pieces of mail you're getting. So the mail volume is not going to be a problem. In fact, it's, you know, their mail overall volume is down because of the economy. But we do have the situation where the Postal Service is comprised of people just like offices are, election offices, and COVID can hit them. And so it's quite possible that we won't see widespread interruption of service, but we can have areas where there are delays. And we see that after a hurricane, we see it after a tornado. So there are a lot of different things that can occur. And that's where it's going to be important to set that expectation. I was on a call the other day with a bunch of reporters from Pennsylvania, and one of them in a number of his pieces has started talking about the fact that we may not have an answer right away. So starting to set that expectation. And here's where, you know, the truth of the matter is often on election night, that very first tranche of results are vote by mail ballots. For those states that can start processing early, they've got that stuff all ready to go, and then they can accumulate, get the total, and put it out, an hour after the polls close or when the polls close. It's not the case that you're really getting all of the results that came in and were voted on election day. It's usually early voting and the vote by mail absentee totals. So what we can do here is, for anyone who really wants to make sure that, that their ballot is in that first announcement, is, again, flatten that curve, get the ballots back early. And the last piece on that is that it is this way for every election. Every election, those are unofficial results. It's not complete for, a week, or in California, 3 weeks, for a variety of reasons. And that's where we need to make sure that our electorate, our public, everybody understands and still has confidence in the system, and that we don't let people call out and try to undermine the results because we don't have them immediately. It comes back to that fast, cheap, and accurate. Fast is not the thing that our system is set up to do. And so we just might need to be patient a little bit longer.
Thank you very much, Tammy Patrick. Wendy, do you feel like you need to be educating the media in particular, but also state legislators to set their expectations that election night may not be possible to call the election, particularly the presidential election and some of the U.S. Senate races?
Absolutely. I'll start with the reporters. I don't know that it's my job personally, but I think all of us who talk to the media need to make that point. And if we start to make it in our phone calls with reporters now, they'll understand it by then. And I will say, this is the first election since I've been paying attention, which is since 2012, from an election administration point of view, when the election administration issues in front of us are by far outweighing the horse race. This is remarkable. And it is an opportunity for those of us who are in this field to educate reporters. And let us hope this never comes around again for other reasons, but let's take advantage of it while it's here. In terms of legislators, I absolutely share this message with them that they, but my real role with them is mostly to answer their questions as opposed to me pontificating to them. But when it comes up, I always say, just remember that the election isn't certified until such and such, and we should expect some delays. Let's just go, every one of us, when we speak out loud, let's all say we can expect some delays in results, and let's all say that our election administration system can handle this. We will get to the right answer at the right time.
Okay, message sent. We've got a bunch of questions here. I've kind of weaved in a few, but maybe we could have like a lightning round and have short answers. We've got a question from Michael's son, who's an election administrator in Minnesota, who's been wrestling with witnessing for mail-in votes. His question is, how important is witness requirements in terms of security and accessibility? How do you balance that? Tammy, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. So I often say that when there is a witness or a notary requirement, you are inserting another person into that voter's voting experience and taking away their autonomy as a voter. So there are other ways to layer in security. Now, I know Minnesota has a long history of signatures and signatures coming up and signature verification, and the way in which that plays out in a very tight race and a very tight recount. But signature verification is really one of the more relied upon ways of ensuring that it is, in fact, the voter that has voted that ballot. So the witness requirement, is often, I think it's problematic because it does insert someone else into their voting experience and takes away their ability to vote by themselves privately. And so I think there are other security measures that make more sense.
Matt, I want to ask you a question from Tim White, who's concerned about the multilingual nature of our electorate today. And he wonders, should all the materials going out to voters be multilingual?
That's a good question. Obviously, there are some protections in federal and state law for covered jurisdictions that are required to share information in multiple languages. I know Tammy, when she was working in Arizona, had many complications with how to provide that to Native American communities in all the languages that they have. So, yeah, I think it's a concern. I think that in the states that that are covered by those requirements, they are sharing the information as is required by law.
And Larry, I would also just jump in really quickly and say that studies have shown that doing bilingual materials, so allowing a voter to be able to affirmatively state what language was their language of choice along with the English, is kind of the preferred best practice.
What do you do in states, though, that have many languages? I mean, here you've got Minnesota in the upper Midwest. We've got, Spanish, and we've got Hmong, and we've got, a variety of East African languages along with English.
Yeah, so it's the same thing. So in those instances, like Los Angeles County is covered for 13, I think, or 14 different languages just in their one county. And so there are some materials that are multilingual that have everything available in one document. But when it comes to things like a ballot and the associated voting instructions, those are usually sent out as a bilingual document in each of the languages that have been identified as being a provision under either federal or state law.
Wendy, we've got a question here from John Bowden, who's concerned about the integrity of the process, particularly when you've got inexperienced vote-by-mail administrators who may be missing postmarks, may have questionable signature verification. Should we be concerned that there may be results that are not legitimate, not because of political tampering, but simply because we're moving fast and we've got inexperienced officials?
I think that's a good argument for some training for local election officials. How to do signature verification is not something that we all learned in kindergarten. We have to learn that from somebody. And there are people in your state that can teach it. Probably they come out of the law enforcement community. And what was the other thing besides the signature verification? Oh, the postmark. There too, I think you can train what is a postmark and what are the alternatives, as Tammy mentioned, to show that it was sent in on time. It is asking a lot of election officials to make these judgment calls. And in terms of the signatures, at least, that it's usually a bipartisan team and they have somebody they can kick it upstairs to if they don't agree on it. So getting those processes honed now is the way to go, and then train if you've got the opportunity.
And I think it's also, if I could just jump in there, it's important to know that every election office in this country already has some form of vote by mail or absentee voting, whether it's their military and overseas, voters with disabilities. So everyone is already doing this. It's just a question of volume.
We've got several questions here from folks who are wondering if what is happening in 2020 sets the kind of new bar, the new kind of baseline for the future of election administration. Is this like the new system that's emerging, that we will now have vote by mail, that we will now have, quite different than where it was, let's say 10 or even 20 years ago? Wendy?
This very morning at NCSL, we were discussing how we will service our members in the future. In the past, we've done a lot of in-person meetings, and now we're doing a lot of Zoom and webinar type things. And the question was, in 2021, will we return or not? Our answer for our purposes is probably it'll be some kind of a hybrid. My thought for election officials is that there is unlikely to be a complete reversal. Some of these laws and efforts are just for this year, but it seems likely that if things go well, this will be the beginning, or continue, you might say, the shift from in-person voting to more mail voting instead.
I mean, if I could add also, I mean, it's not like this is a new shift, right? I mean, the trend is very clear over the past 10, 15 years that people are voting absentee, early in person. They want to do that. So this is not a new shift. It's just accelerated.
Kim Nelson, who I think wins the award for most questions, has a number of good ones. Here's one. A lot of our economy has moved online shopping, telemedicine, and so forth. Why is it so hard to do online voting? It would seem to be kind of our age. Why isn't it straightforward?
All right, I'll take that one. First of all, the most prominent reason for it is because it is not anonymous. You can do your online banking because you can go into your account and compare it. There's all sorts of end-to-end cryptography that have come out as possible solutions, but it's just not there yet. We're not ready for that on a grand scale. And so I think that there are countries around the globe, Estonia, the Netherlands, and others that have tried it, and they have reduced the reliance upon it because of issues. So we're not quite there yet. We eventually, I think, could get there. And there are many solution providers right now that allow you to get your ballot on your smartphone, make your marks, and then go into a polling place, scan that on the device, and then have it print out a paper record. So we do have that sort of interface where you can use your own assistive technology, your own personal tech, and still get that paper record, which is so critical for audits and recounts.
We're out of time, but we're just going to go into overtime for this last question, which is about, do students face a particular hurdle voting this year, particularly those who lived in a state and now have found their college university closed? They've had to change their residence, and they're maybe confused about where they should vote, how they should vote. Advice to students out there.
How about get yourself, check where would you like to vote and get yourself on that list. And if you do want to vote at the university, but you're still at home because of COVID-19, that's fine. Ask for the absentee ballot from there, or vice versa.
That is a perfect short answer. Thank you very much. We've now run out of time, so I want to thank this terrific panelists. You folks are all stars. Thank you so much. And thank you, Senator Klobuchar, for joining us.